I've heard it said by notable Calvinists like Dr. James White that Isaiah chapter 10, verse 12 through 17 supports compatibilism. So the question is, what in the world is compatibilism? Well, according to the Pocket Dictionary of Theological Terms on page 28, it says the theory that human free will is consistent or compatible with God's sovereign prerogative to determine or will all things that are to happen. And I want us to also see, though, with regards to how John Feinberg, in his book, The Doctrine of God, defines the term on page 291. So here's the book, of course. On page 291, this is what he says about compatibilism. It says, according to a form of determinism known as compatibilism, an action is free so long as there are antecedent conditions which decisively incline the agent's will in one way or another without constraining it. So, did you notice what he said? He said that compatibilism is a form of determinism. So determinism means that God determines all things. According to the French philosopher Guillaume Bignon, of course, if God determines all things, then it literally means in the sense that he really did determine all things that come to pass. And he does mean everything, whether it's good or bad. God determined all things. But I want us to see, though, with regards to Isaiah chapter 10, verse 12 through 17. Now, before I do that, I want to unpack, give just a brief summary of what it says in verse 5 through 11. You can go and read this for yourself. But basically, God determines to use Assyria as the rod through which his wrath is vented to the nation of Israel because of their sin. So God is using the Assyrian army to judge the Israelites. And like I said, people like Dr. James White say that this is a good place to see compatibilism on display. Now, verse 12 through 17 says, but when the Lord finishes all his work against Mount Zion and Jerusalem, he will say, I will punish the king of Assyria for his arrogant acts and the proud look in his eyes. For he said, I have done this by my own strength and wisdom, for I am clever. I abolished the borders of nations and plundered the treasures like a mighty warrior. I subjected the inhabitants. My hand has reached out as if into a nest to seize the wealth of the nations. Like one gathering eggs, I gathered the whole earth. No wing fluttered, nor beak opened or chirped. Does an axe exalt itself above the one who chops it? Does a saw magnify itself above the one who saws with it? It would be like a rod waving to the one who lifted it. It would be like a staff lifting the one who isn't wood. Therefore the Lord of armies will inflict an emaciating disease on the well-fed of Assyria, and he will kindle a burning fire under its glory. Israel's light will become a fire, and its Holy One a flame. In one day it will burn and consume Assyria's thorns and thistles. So, let's look at the text with regards to why the king of Assyria is being judged. He's being judged because of his heart, his pride, his arrogance. But, see, the issue is for the Calvinistic position, whether it's a compatibilism, which is soft determinism, or whether it is a hard determinism. Of course, God would determine all things that come to pass, even according to one of the well-known confessions, the Westminster Confession of 1646. It says in chapter 3, paragraph 1, on God's eternal decree, it says, God from all eternity did by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass. Yet, as thereby neither is God the author of sin, nor is violence offered to the will of the creatures, nor is the liberty or contingency of a second cause taken away, but rather established. So, did you notice what it said? It said that God, through his most holy will, sovereignly and unchangeably decreed whatsoever comes to pass. But did you notice the caveat where it says that God is not the author of sin? Now the question is, why in the world did they do this? They put the caveat in there because if they did not, then they have a problem with theodicy. Now theodicy is simply the problem of evil. But if you logically look at the Calvinistic system, if God determines whatsoever comes to pass, then logically speaking, he would be the author of sin, and a consistent Calvinist would have to reject his Calvinism in favor of the biblical standard saying that God is not the author of sin and evil because God is good according to the scriptures. But the issue with regards to the text in Isaiah is that if God sovereignly and unchangeably brings about all that happens, then we have God decreeing the sinful heart of the Assyrian king on the Calvinistic system. And then God turns around and judges that man for the sin that he's decreed that man to do. So my point is, though, that if this is taken to a Calvinistic understanding, then God would be unjust because the Assyrian king could not do otherwise because, according to the Westminster Confession, there that God sovereignly and unchangeably brings about all that happens. So on the Calvinistic system, then the Assyrian king could not have done otherwise. So, but I want us to see, though, that, as I said, God will be unjust to judge the man for not being able to do otherwise, because if the Calvinism is true, then God decreed for the pride and the arrogance that the king had. But let's actually look what the scriptures say and see if we can come to a better conclusion. For example, we look in 1 John chapter 2, verse 16. It says, "For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride in one's possession is not from the Father, but is from the world." So pride and lust are not from the Father. So therefore God did not determine the king to have the arrogance and pride that he did have. Therefore, if we take an understanding from the biblical record that God does not determine pride and lust, but yet he used the Assyrian king, his pride and arrogance, in order to judge Israel, because that's what the king wanted to do anyways, we can see that God is just in using that man in that capacity and being able to then turn around, because the man is arrogant and sinful and prideful, and then judge the king for his sinful heart. So what I'm saying is there is no need for Calvinism or determinism to make sense of the biblical record. If we read the biblical record for what it is, and we do not superimpose Calvinism over it, then we will come away with a better biblical understanding, in my opinion.